that is wholly wrong, inappropriate, and disgusting, frankly.
Likely true. Should somebody not say something that's true because you don't like it?
No. Well, what if it's true? Basically, what he was threatening was a resumption of violence unless he got his way.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 168 for the 7th of December 2023. John will be 40 next month. Or he would be if he had lived. But he didn't. He died. He died of 28 stab wounds, which he suffered shortly after his birth in 1984. Neither John's parents nor his murderer have ever been identified, though we can guess that there may be some overlap there, given that a short time later his newborn body, partially decomposed, was washed ashore with 28 stab wounds near Cahersiveen. But the fact that his parents and or murderers were never identified didn't stop some people from jumping to conclusions. At about the same time, 80 kilometres to the northeast in Abbeydorney, also in County Kerry, there was a woman who had what was known at the time, this was the 1980s, she had a reputation. What that meant was she came from a poor farming family. They didn't have much education, and she had a boyfriend who was married to someone else. That sort of thing would get you a reputation in rural Ireland at the time, and not a reputation that would do you any good. It certainly didn't do Joanne Hayes any good, and when it was observed locally that she was pregnant, I think we can conclude that congratulations and best wishes were not the first things that came to the minds or to the lips of many of her neighbours. When it was evident that Joanne was no longer pregnant and there was no sign of a baby, that surely drew attention. When John's tiny murdered body was washed ashore 80 kilometres down the coast, it was probably reasonable to ask questions. But confirmation bias is a powerful thing. The Gardaí arrested Joanne and her entire family. What happened when they were arrested is disputed, but what can't be disputed is the confessions that the entire family signed, very strange confessions, which implicated every member of the family in stabbing John to death and disposing of his body in the sea. That was my first draft of that paragraph. Yes, what happened when the whole family was arrested is disputed, but disputed or not, it doesn't stop it from being blindingly obvious to anyone with an ounce of intelligence. The family were battered or bullied or browbeaten into making false confessions containing details that could only be known to the murderers and the investigating Gardaí. Joanne Hayes was charged with murder. The family promptly withdrew their confessions, saying that they had been threatened, coerced, harassed, physically intimidated and assaulted into making false confessions. Joanne Hayes said that she had given birth at home. Her baby had died shortly after birth. Not very surprising, neither mother nor child had any pre- or postnatal medical care. She said her baby had been buried on their farm. The farm was searched, and her baby was found and exhumed. Since the Hayes family had nothing to do with the murdered baby, the only way the details of that murder could have found their way into the false confessions is if they were supplied by the interrogators. On their face, the confessions were dubious. The confessions go out of their way to clarify that every member of the family went out of their way to have a hand in the murder, a murder that they had nothing to do with. But with the body of Joanne's baby now found, the confessions went from being dubious to being clearly fabricated. And any investigator with an ounce of intelligence could not have helped but know that they were fabricated. The Gardaí now had the bodies of 2 babies, hence the name of this case, the Kerry babies case, babies, plural, not possessive. And they had the confessions of a whole family to a murder that they didn't commit, containing details that they therefore couldn't have known. The murder case was thrown out by the judge. He had little other choice, but the way that official Ireland swung to the defence of its representatives is what is really remarkable about this case. The trial judge threw out the murder charge against Joanne Hayes without hesitation, but the behaviour of the next judge to look at the case was truly breathtaking. There was a tribunal of inquiry into the case, conducted by Mr. Justice Kevin Lynch. The Gardaí involved were represented by high-powered legal representatives at taxpayers' expense. Days on end were spent discussing the ludicrous theory that Joanne Hayes had ovulated 2 eggs, had sex with 2 different men during a short period of time, and became pregnant with twins, one fathered by her boyfriend, the other fathered by an unknown male. There wasn't a shred of evidence to support this theory. Its sole purpose was to try to keep alive the possibility that Joanne had given birth to, and then murdered, both babies. The fact that the deaths and the disposal of the bodies of both babies had almost nothing in common should have told anyone that there was no likely connection between the two. But even putting that aside, though DNA tests were not available at the time, blood type tests showed that the babies could not have had the same father, so the vanishingly rare possibility of superfecundation was brought up. It's blindingly obvious that the reason this convoluted nonsense was dreamt up was solely to avoid the blindingly obvious conclusion that the Hayes family confessions were coerced. The lawyers representing the Gardaí were hearing hooves and not so much thinking zebras. They were insisting that it was unicorns. Now, however hard their lawyers worked to shield the Gardaí from the consequences of their misdeeds, Tribunal Chairman Justice Kevin Lynch worked far harder. Firstly, he found in his report that Joanne killed her own baby, the one buried on the farm, by choking it to death to stop it crying. Not only was there no medical evidence to support this finding, no other type of evidence either, it flatly contradicted the evidence, in fact, of the then state pathologist Dr. John Harbison, who said he was not able to determine the cause of death. Judge Lynch literally pulled it out of his wig. He also rejected the Hayes family evidence that they were assaulted, threatened and coerced into making false confessions, but as Jean Kerrigan later wrote, he never, quote, convincingly explained how people who were entirely innocent of any involvement whatever in stabbing a baby should make very detailed confessions that fitted into the facts of the baby found on the beach. Kevin Lynch was later appointed to the Supreme Court. But it didn't end there. Joanne Hayes co-wrote a book called My Story, but 4 of the Gardaí involved in the case sued pretty much everyone involved in that book and received £100,000, a vast sum at the time. One of those Gardaí who was compensated was Superintendent Joe Shelley. By an astonishing coincidence, Superintendent Shelley was later transferred to Raphoe, County Donegal, and in 1996 he was a key member of the Garda team in the notorious investigation of the death of cattle dealer Richie Barron, which led to another tribunal of inquiry which didn't have such a pleasing outcome for Shelley. The report from Justice Morris said that he bore responsibility for the, quote, prejudiced, tendentious and utterly negligent investigation of Richie Barron's death. 4 years later, the now promoted Detective Superintendent Shelley was stationed in the Midlands, where he was the scene commander who called in armed Gardaí to lay siege to the home of a mentally ill man, John Carthy. John Carthy was shot dead by Gardaí at the scene in an incident that led to yet another tribunal, which also made detailed criticisms of Garda actions on the day. The Hayes family were paid substantial damages in 2020 and received an apology from the government arising out of the unfounded findings made by the Tribunal of Inquiry in the 1980s, just a few months after Justice Kevin Lynch died. The identity of John, who would have been 40 next April, has never been established. In a moment, we'll have that interview with Ben Habib, but first I want to say thank you to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate all of them. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, not nearly in the same league as some other Irish podcasters, but we don't mind that. It pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. And it's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron. It lets us know that there are people out there listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a pint or even the price of a cup of coffee once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show. The party Reform UK grew out of Nigel Farage's Brexit Party, which he formed after he left UKIP. They had 29 MEPs elected to the European Parliament in 2019. They stayed there briefly. And one of those MEPs is now one of the deputy leaders of Reform UK. He's Ben Habib. He joins me on the line now. Ben was born in Karachi in Pakistan, and he was educated in England, where he became a successful businessman. Ben, what tempted you away from business and into politics?
Well, I haven't left business. I'm still chief executive of my property company, First Property Group PLC, in which I'm a substantial shareholder as well. But my foray into politics is really not by any desire to be in politics. Frankly, I very much hope the British government, in whatever complexion it is, does whatever is necessary to fulfill British national interest so that I can go back to my day job. I'm only in politics because I feel the British government, successive British governments, have so badly let the country down.
Understood. You, on your pinned tweet on Twitter, or whatever we're supposed to call it these days, it says, "I'm proud of our language, history, empire, heritage, national heroes, national identity, values, and most of all, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We all should be." That kind of states, I think, even though obviously you are in business, that states a fairly clear political outlook, which you are entitled to. And obviously this podcast is for an Irish audience, and
Sure.
You coming, with obviously a background partly in Pakistan or in the empire, I guess, that has a bit of resonance for Irish people, and it might be a bit surprising. Would you regard someone like General Reginald Dyer as one of the heroes of the empire?
Well, General Dyer was definitely not one of the heroes. He was a black spot on the empire's history. But the empire, first of all, can I just say, before I answer your question, I am as proud of the United Kingdom and a believer in its right and correctness for it to be independent, sovereign, and a proud nation, as I am a believer that Ireland should be an independent, sovereign, proud nation, as indeed should be France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Greece. And I think one of the problems with the way politics is now practiced across Western democracies is that we're taught not to be proud of our countries, but to think more in the global collective. Mm-hmm. And whilst I see great benefits in global cooperation, I think the pendulum has swung far too far in the direction of global policies for the global betterment of peoples and away from national interests. And I think it's beginning to hollow out Western democracies and our ability to make change for the betterment, not just of our own people, but of the globe. So,
sure, and I'll allow you to get into that. And just for the Irish listeners who maybe are not familiar with that reference, I just should say in 1919, obviously in British-controlled India, which included what is now Pakistan and several other countries, this guy, Reginald Dyer, ordered his troops to open fire without warning on a large crowd of unarmed civilians, including women and children. Hundreds, perhaps into the thousands of people were killed. They only stopped shooting when they ran out of ammunition. And Dyer actually himself later said that he had taken armoured cars to machine gun the people, but he regretted that the cars weren't able to fit through the narrow streets to launch the attack. And you say he was a black spot, but the reality is that isn't something that is agreed by all British people. At the time, the Morning Post, which is a forerunner of the Daily Telegraph, said that Dyer was the man who saved India. They started a benefit fund for him, which raised over the equivalent of about 1.3 million euro in today's money. At the time, the Archbishop of Canterbury called him a brave, public-spirited, patriotic soldier, and the Secretary of State for India, a guy by the name of Edwin Montagu, was perceived to be insufficiently supporting Dwyer, and this led to really intense campaign against him, particularly amongst Tory MPs. It was explicitly anti-Semitic. Dyer was Jewish. And I just bring that up because, that would have a lot of resonance in Ireland. And obviously for you, Amritsar is on the Indian side of the border, but it's very close to that line that was drawn between what is now India and Pakistan by Viscount Cyril Radcliffe. And in 1997, which is not that long ago, Queen Elizabeth visited Amritsar and she pointedly refused to apologise for that atrocity, and her husband, Prince Philip, accused the Indians of exaggerating it. And, you say, and I agree with you entirely, and I think you are sincere, that was a black mark on the empire. But do you feel comfortable in a country where not everyone agrees with that?
Yeah, I think there are very few British citizens today who would disagree that was a black spot. There had been. I'm not a historian. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm not a specialist in this particular subject, but there had been troubles in India running up to the point when General Dyer went into that small market square and opened fired indiscriminately against women and children. There had been trouble. Large gatherings had been banned. They were illegal, and people had been warned that they will be dealt with force.
Mm-hmm.
So
and whipped if they didn't salute a British soldier.
Yeah, there had been trouble, and there had been new regulations passed which prohibited the gathering of people. So I'm not going to forgive General Dyer for it. I'm not going to forgive that period in history. But when I talk about being proud of the empire, I'm talking about the empire as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And the empire spans, or in my view, the empire really kicks off under possibly Henry VIII, but definitely by the time you get to Queen Elizabeth, there are imperial signs emerging from the United Kingdom, from Great Britain rather, because it wasn't even Great Britain, it was England.
Yeah.
Back in those days, England and Wales, and then you have all the period from her through until 1947. Really, I think is the death
independence
knell
of
for the
India.
Empire. Yeah, I think the independence
And
of
Pakistan,
India.
I should say. Apologies.
And Pakistan. And of course, Amritsar Pakistan was part of India when the Amritsar massacre took place. And whilst my father was born on the Pakistani side of the border, we have a shared history with India.
Mm-hmm.
And half of me is Pakistani, and my father is very critical of that particular episode. And obviously, justifiably so. But the empire as a whole, I think, was an enlightened period, not just for the United Kingdom, but enlightened for the globe. And there were very many great things that came from the empire, including the exportation of what we developed in the United Kingdom during the Agrarian Revolution and then the Industrial Revolution, a recognition within the United Kingdom that it's diversity of thought, effectively a recognition that it's diversity of thought that gives rise to progress. And we shared that with the world. And you see that in the way that British law, common law, was established across the globe for the great betterment of international trade. international trade still is very largely governed by British law because it works so well. And then, of course, you have all the benefits of the more the optical contributions made by the empire, the building of schools, railways, infrastructure, wonderful architectural buildings, wide avenues, and so on and so forth. And I have the great privilege of having been born in 1965 in Pakistan, which was immediately post-imperial Karachi. And democracy hadn't, we technically had a democracy, but it hadn't fully settled in. The country was effectively run by generals who had been educated at Sandhurst. And
That's the British
we had
military
a very,
college.
yeah, exactly, the, sort of elite British officers college. And even though I don't want to get into debate about democracy, though we can in the context of Pakistan, if you like. But notwithstanding the fact that we didn't have a settled democracy in Pakistan in those days, it was a very peaceable time. It was a very prosperous time for the country. The country's future was seen to be bright. In many ways, it could have been the Singapore of the Middle East. It could have been the Dubai of the Middle East. It was set fair. And the legacy of the British Empire, at least for Pakistan, is now being rewritten as a result, I think, of failed Pakistani governments not delivering for the people of Pakistan and then pointing back to the empire as the cause of their problems. But when I go back to the memories of my childhood, I can't tell you anything other than positive things about the legacy of the empire, and indeed the way people thought of the empire in Pakistan at that point in time. All my peer group were very keen and comfortable with their imperial past and being associated with the United Kingdom. They saw Britishness as something of which to be proud, and they were very proud to be part of the Commonwealth. And I think if there's one element which testifies to the good of the empire, it is that so many ex-imperial countries decided to join the Commonwealth to keep that body going, for the cooperation amongst those states to continue. And so the empire spanned, 400 years, and it did enormous good over those years, including, of course, the abolition of the slave trade, the first country in history to abolish the slave trade, then police the high seas to shut it down and make sure other people weren't practicing it, during the 19th century, at significant cost in both monetary terms and lives, in policing it. We established human rights at a time when, the empire was at its zenith, when no one was calling or insisting on us to establish human rights. And the modern narrative, that the United Kingdom, for example, shouldn't leave the European Convention of Human Rights because it would become like a pariah state, such as Russia, that isn't a member, is a completely false and wrong narrative.
We'll come back to that. I think that's a good point. That's a good point to come back to. So I hate to interrupt your flow, but I will come back to that.
More or less finished.
That's good. That's good. And what I want to address is, I actually agree with where I think you were going at the start of that. I think you're right that it's important to have a sophisticated understanding of something that was an enormous thing, and to say all good or all bad is probably not a very sophisticated understanding of how history works. But do you think that, well, I guess two questions. Number one, do you think that perhaps you have an insufficiently skeptical view of it? And number two, in particular, the people who are enthusiastic for the British Empire in Britain today, I'm wondering if you're confident that they would accept you as a child of the empire.
So let me just take your second point first. And I think the implication is that there might be racism in amongst those people who are proud of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. And I want to hit that very hard. People in recent years continually tell me that British institutions are racist against minority ethnic people. Mm-hmm.
I haven't said that.
Another great... No. But people have said it.
I'm talking about the individuals.
It seems to be... it seems to be prevalent in modern discourse that the United Kingdom is institutionally racist. And I can tell you that of all the institutions I've attended,
I think you're going for a
for
straw man there, Ben, because I haven't said that.
Yeah,
and
okay.
I actually think I agree with you that as countries go, Britain performs exceptionally well on that score. But my question is, even performing exceptionally well, there is a spectrum of views within Britain. And I'm wondering if you're comfortable being in the political position you are in, because I suspect that the uglier end of that spectrum might be concentrated in the type of political views that you espouse.
Well, I haven't come across it. I mean, I genuinely haven't met anyone.
Pause then for a second, because your party leader, I think, again, is Richard Tice. He was certainly the lead candidate for what was then the Brexit Party in 2020 in Hartlepool. And I just want to play this very short clip from Channel 4, from a Channel 4 undercover investigation.
We tried to put a big pig's head in the concrete. We got over the fence, when they were doing the groundwork. And they had all the bouncers who do all the North East. We were doing the security for that mosque. Yeah. So when we got in, the caught us out because we were going to take a video with a pig's head under their concrete. Let them finish it. Let it all get built, and just send the video out and say, look, there you go. You've got a pig's head under your mosque there, so you'll have to get it all knocked down and redone again, or we'll just leave it because it's desecrated ground, innit?
I'm sure you're familiar with that, and I'm not suggesting that everybody involved in the Brexit Party or Reform UK, as it is now, is a racist. But far from it. I'm sure that that's not the case. But would you accept that there is maybe a concentration there of an uglier type of attitude? Bear in mind that man was an elected councillor who sat first for UKIP and then for the Brexit Party. And that type of prejudice seems to, I mean, I have no idea what your religious beliefs are, but I suspect neither does he. And that would not restrain him from being very prejudiced indeed against you.
Yeah, so that guy, I'm familiar with the clip. I think there were two people involved in the clip, and they were both thrown out of the party immediately after
that's right.
The clip was released. What I can say is that the Brexit Party doubled the diversity in the European Parliament. There were twice as many MEPs from ethnic minorities as a result of us being there than were there before we got there.
I think British MEPs.
No, MEPs.
In
MEPs
total, out of the 700 odd?
In total, absolutely. Okay. It's remarkable. Mm-hmm. It's remarkable. But I don't want to make a play on ethnicity being an important thing. I'm very against policies made for the promotion of ethnic minorities. I think people should be judged on the content of their character and not on the color of their skin. Mm-hmm. And I've been brought up to believe that everyone is equal, and the world should be run largely on a meritocratic basis, not on any other basis, because that is how you get the best out of people. But I don't deny for a second that there are racists in the United Kingdom, as indeed there are racists in India, Pakistan, Africa, Middle East, right across the world. Some of the most racist people.
Focus on the issue that. Yeah. Would you accept that there is, without wanting to slander the bulk of your supporters or your party members, there is an unfortunate concentration of that type of belief in your party?
I don't accept that. I don't accept that view. Not at all. No. I think being proud of your country.
Do you think that Leave EU, of which I think Richard Tice, your now party leader, was chairman, they made an explicit decision not to discuss the economic effects of Brexit during the referendum in 2016 and to focus pretty much exclusively on immigration? Do you think that was appealing to racists? Do you think that racists found that appealing?
No, I mean, I'm anti-immigration in the way that it's being practiced at the moment, and I can assure you I am not racist. I'm against it for cultural and nation-state reasons, which I can go into if you like.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand that. Very, very briefly explain that, but just very briefly.
Yeah, so Suella Braverman was right. Another lady of different ethnic origin. She's not white British. Yeah. Multiculturalism, the way it's been practiced in the United Kingdom, is not working. We've had more immigrants come to the United Kingdom in the last 25 years than we had in all of history before that. And what you should be getting out of multiculturalism, what you should get with it, positive immigration, is a coming together of different ideas, a diversity of thought, out of which emerges new ideas through which society can homogeneously and largely harmoniously progress forward. Diversity of thought, not diversity of cultures living independently in ghettos. And sadly, it is the latter that we've got. And what we're being told is that we must tolerate and accept very different values to our own and promote those values, if necessary, to the detriment of our own values, and that they should be allowed to go on existing alongside other multicultural groupings, and that there should be no attempt of assimilation. Assimilation's almost a bad word, but I completely disagree with it. I think that if people come to the United Kingdom, they need to buy into being British. They need to be proud of being British. They need to understand what British values are, what our traditional institutions are, and we need to meld together as a homogeneous society. And perhaps I say that, William, because my mother is white Anglo-Saxon, probably goes back to prior to Normandy, the Norman landings, prior to that, in her Britishness. And my Pakistani side is equally long in the tooth, from the subcontinent. And I see huge benefits in cultures coming together. I see very little, if no benefits, in cultures coexisting alongside each other separately and often in disharmony.
Sure, I think that's entirely rational. I think that's entirely rational. I think that's not a, and I think I'm confident, because I've heard you speak before and I know a little bit about you. I'm confident that you're saying that, from a sincere point of view. But the point that I was making, I do want to move on, but the point that I was making was that I'm not confident that that is what is being heard by a lot of the people who might be supporting you, voting for your party. And I'm curious as to whether you're comfortable with that. And in addition, I should say, and you mentioned the benefits of the British Empire, the research would indicate that that was a catastrophe economically for India, that before the British arrived, India was vastly richer as a proportion of world wealth at the time than it was when the British left. But I don't want to get hung up on that, because I'm interested in your party, and it has been scoring really remarkably well in the opinion polls. You're ranging, for quite a new and small party in the UK, that's a very difficult thing to be. You're ranging maybe from about 7 to 11% in the polls, once in a while coming in ahead of the Liberal Democrats in third place. But in the past 6 months, there's been about 6 by-elections, and you have only broken 4% once in that. Mostly you're about 3-point-something% when you run in the by-elections. There is a theory that Reform UK is being oversampled in the polls because your support is disproportionately online, and then when a lot of polls these days have an online component, that is causing your party to have an inflated figure in the polls. Are you cautious? Are you aware of that? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. We're not scoring in elections in the same way that the polling indicates we should be. And but we are gaining traction, and we are an insurgent party. In many ways, perhaps it was a mistake to have changed the name from Brexit Party to Reform UK, because we had to establish a new identity. And Brexit still, in my view, hasn't been delivered. So I think it would have been quite correct to have retained the name Brexit Party, which was very well known across the UK. But we are making inroads. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I'd say just a couple of things, if I may, on that. Sure. The first is that I joined Reform UK for one principal reason. It was to give electoral political effect to my view that the Conservative Party must be driven out of office and its parliamentary membership must be obliterated, because the Conservative Party is not acting in a conservative way, and it most certainly is not acting in the interest of the United Kingdom. And what Reform UK has successfully already achieved is take sufficient votes away from the Tory party to make sure that they lose by-elections. And we intend to stand against them in every single seat in Great Britain, possibly also 1 or 2 in Northern Ireland. Though obviously the Conservatives and Labour Party don't stand there, but every single seat in Great Britain, and we intend to destroy the Tory parliamentary party, because failure cannot be rewarded with incumbency, and unless those who govern us make the connection between success and being rewarded with, a victory at elections, unless they can make that connection. Success breeds victory at elections. Failure means you're going to be ejected. And unless and until that connection is made, we're going to get worse and worse governance in the United Kingdom. And for far too long, the British electorate and the British political establishment has traded at election time on the principle that we know we're bad, but the other lot are worse.
I should come in with that, because given the rather unusual electoral system that exists in Britain, the reality of that is that instead of having a 50-seat majority, Keir Starmer might end up with a 200 or more seat majority. How do you feel about that?
He might. What I would hope is that people who want change, who genuinely want small c conservative values, vote for Reform UK, and that instead of Keir Starmer ending up with a thumping majority, and remember, a lot of Labour voters also are small c conservatives, I would rather hope that Reform UK end up with a balance of power. But it is possible that we don't win a single seat. Nevertheless, it is vital from a moral hazard perspective that the Tory parliamentary party, I don't mean the party itself, because they're very good membership base, I've got nothing against the party, but the parliamentary party have acted in opposition to its membership, in opposition to the electoral decisions made in the United Kingdom, and to the great damage of the United Kingdom, and they need to be turfed out wholesale. Whether that comes with something that's worse with Labour, or hopefully with Reform UK holding some kind of balance of power in Parliament, we'll find out, and remains to be seen. But there should be no basis on which the Tory parliamentary party should be returned into government based on their past performance.
I was almost going to ask you, but I think you have answered the question, how you feel about the current government, so I won't bother with that question since you've made it fairly clear. And in particular, I don't want to relitigate the arguments around Brexit, but particularly for Irish listeners, you were one of the litigants in a case taken initially in the High Court in Belfast against the Northern Ireland Protocol of the withdrawal agreement between the UK and the EU. Briefly, can you just tell me what was the motivation behind that case?
Well, because Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, by definition, doesn't exist if Northern Ireland's not in it. And the Northern Ireland Protocol, in all respects, takes Northern Ireland out of the British Customs Union. It therefore aligns Northern Ireland in many respects, in thousands of its laws with, no, it doesn't align. It makes Northern Ireland subject to thousands of European Union laws, effectively laws made by a foreign legislature and enforced by a foreign court. And that, for me, is an affront to the integrity of the United Kingdom. And I don't believe for a second that having customs arrangements on the island of Ireland in itself would have undermined the Good Friday Agreement. In fact, the Good Friday Agreement implicitly recognizes the border. It refers to the border a number of times between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And as part of the Good Friday Agreement, the Republic gave up its constitutional claim to Northern Ireland. And therefore, Northern Ireland should never have been allowed to be partitioned away from Great Britain with this, customs border down the Irish Sea.
That was done. The Good Friday Agreement and giving up the territorial claim was done in the context of having essentially a frictionless border whereby people who are very large and growing proportion. If I can just finish, Ben. They had an aspiration partially met, that they were able to, essentially nationalist people, not necessarily nationalist people, but people who wanted not to have their towns, their villages, sometimes even their houses separated by an economic border that interrupted their lives, even if there was to be a sovereignty border. And that was very much felt to be part of the deal. And the reality was that the EU, when they had the first meeting after the Brexit vote, they said, and it was clear as the light of day, they said that one of the three priorities for the EU was Ireland. And the idea that you could have a hard border between the south and the north, and that being workable, is just laughable to anybody who lives in Ireland, north or south. That is just obviously not possible to happen. And to put it bluntly, Margaret Thatcher said that Northern Ireland is as British as Finchley, and she is just flat wrong. It's not. A very large proportion of the population, perhaps trending towards a majority, does not have a cultural or political allegiance to Britain, and that has to be accounted for. And you clearly do, and there are people in Northern Ireland who do have that, and that is why there are special arrangements for Northern Ireland, and simply unilaterally abandoning them was never going to be a runner.
So just to answer your points, first of all, the Good Friday Agreement makes no explicit or implicit claim that there should be a frictionless border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Indeed,
sure, but it didn't contemplate the possibility of Brexit. That is correct.
Indeed, there were and remain economic differences between the North and the South. For example, currency, different corporation tax rates, different regulations on financial services, and so on. So there is already an economic border there. Trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic is not frictionless. Even now, it's not frictionless. So that's the first point.
Ben, I have to answer that, and I will allow you to continue. But for the people in Northern Ireland, so for example, milk produced on farms in Northern Ireland does not have the capacity to process a large proportion of that. That is then trucked south into dairies in the south to be processed into cheese and butter and so forth, and that's then exported around the world, and that's of an economic benefit both to the north and to the south. Had there been no withdrawal agreement, the EU would have been a third country. The tariff is something like 20 cents per litre on milk, which is, I think, higher than actually the wholesale, the farm gate price, or it's very close to it. So it would have been utterly impossible for that trade to happen. There is no infrastructure for that milk to be processed in Northern Ireland. That's in the south. And clearly the farmers would not have been able to continue feeding their cattle if they had no market for it. It's not something that can be exported to Britain, raw milk. And they would have been forced essentially to shoot about a third of the cattle in Northern Ireland, the milking cows in Northern Ireland, basically the next morning if there had been a hard Brexit. There is no question that through many, many industries, and I'm sure you can point to, financial services and so forth, where there is a degree of friction, but just for on the ground people whose villages and towns and townlands are divided by the border, there is simply no way that would have been doable, let alone in any way acceptable.
Yeah, okay. I mean, just on the point of killing cows, just since you made the point, I'm not sure are you aware that the Republic of Ireland is proposing killing 200,000 dairy cows in order to comply with climate agenda?
I've heard that. That is untrue, and it's a different topic, so I'm not going to get into it. And I want to focus on the fact that an economic border, such as would have happened in the event of a hard Brexit, simply wasn't viable. There's just no way that could have happened.
Well, that is your view, William, and obviously, that's your view. But I think it's quite possible for there have been mutual recognition of enforcement of exports as opposed to a requirement to police import, which is the way the border works. And I don't believe that it is any more constitutionally acceptable for the so-called hard border to go down the Irish Sea than it is to put it on the island of Ireland, where actually a constitutional border and an economic border already exists.
Why is that?
One of the problems I've got with the
why?
Well, because if you talk about the fact that you talk about the Republican nationalists who live in Northern Ireland, there are
just ordinary people, yes,
who live in Northern Ireland, and they are British. And why should their link with Great Britain? You refer to it as a hard border, so you presumably accept that the Irish Sea border is a hard border, because you can't accept, you can't propose, you can't. You see, this is part of the.
Can I? You're asking a
that
question.
I've
I should be asking the questions, but you asked a question. Why should it be? And let me tell you why. Because there is nobody whose village or town, and in some cases house, is on one side of the IRC and the other part is on the other side of the IRC, which is what happens across the border in Ireland. No, pause. You asked a question and I'm going to answer it.
But that happens at the moment.
No, just 1 second. It does not happen across the IRC that, for example, a farmer buys a truckload of hay from his neighbour a couple of kilometres down the road, who happens to be across the border. That does not happen across the IRC, and that does happen in Ireland, and the disruption created
a customs border. It wouldn't have changed any of that.
Yes, because hold on for a second. But a customs border most certainly would have disrupted that, because many of those trades, milk, animal feedstuffs, and so forth, are required by WTO rules to be treated equally for all third countries. So Ireland would have been, and the EU would have been required by WTO rules to treat milk or animal feedstuffs coming, for example, from Belarus into the EU to Poland as literally from one farmer buying a load of hay off another farmer down the road.
I don't accept that there could not have been provision made for specific industry sectors for like electricity, for example, to continue to trade seamlessly between Northern Ireland and the Republic. There was no need for a hard border either on the island of Ireland or down the IRC, which is now where it resides. The entire debate.
And why is that such a principle? For example, there's a pretty hard economic border between the Canaries and Spain, both of which are sovereign Spain territory, but one part is outside the EU. The Canaries are not part of the EU, but the rest of the Spain is. Why is that such a thing?
I mean, the issue. Look, for me, it's simple. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. It is not part of the Republic of Ireland, and there is a border that is recognised by the Republic on the island of Ireland. It separates two different economic zones in many respects, which continues to subsist. And the entire customs border issue, in my view, was hijacked by Leo Varadkar, who, and I'm going to say things now which are going to offend you potentially, William.
I doubt it.
He weaponized the border issue by going to a summit in the European Union in 2018 with a bombed-out border post photograph from 1972 and said, if you put customs checks on the island of Ireland, this is what's going to happen. And that is wholly wrong, inappropriate, and disgusting, frankly.
Likely true. Should somebody not say something that's true because you don't like it?
No. Well, what if it's true? Basically, what he was threatening was a resumption of violence unless he got what he
okay, Ben, I'm going to pause you because I don't want you to embarrass yourself. Anybody suggesting that Leo Varadkar, the leader of Fine Gael, and anybody with any knowledge of the internal politics of Ireland will know that is hot nonsense. The likelihood of Fine Gael threatening IRA violence is just laughable.
You're welcome. I disagree. When you say this is what will happen if you put a border here, that's a threat of violence. That's saying the IRA will resume its bombings.
Ben, if I tell you that you are going to be smashed to bits if you jump off a cliff, that is not a threat.
It is a threat. It's a threat.
If I tell you that your body will be torn to pieces on rocks below if you jump off a 100-metre high cliff, that is not a threat of violence. That is a calm explanation of the results of your actions.
Jumping off a cliff is giving yourself over to the immutable forces of physics, which will render you asunder. Whether the IRA starts bombing border posts or not is up to the IRA. They have free will and personal agency. If their personal agency is being used as evidence for the border not being put between Northern Ireland and the Republic, effectively, it's a threat of a resumption of violence.
Okay, but pause. Okay, Ben, this is where we go back to perhaps also the partition of India. Allow me to answer what you're saying.
Much point. Yeah, but William, I don't see much point in you and I debating this. I will not agree with you.
Then allow me to put a point to you that you can react to. And this is why I mentioned at the start the partition between India and Pakistan. The reality is that Northern Ireland is not as British as Finchley. And there are people there who are as British as the people in Finchley, but there are also people who are not. And in order to maintain the fiction that Northern Ireland was as British as Finchley, they needed to send British troops onto the streets to essentially murder people in cold blood. Now, I'm not for a moment justifying IRA violence, and there is a whole complicated history there, but the one piece to pull out of that is that Northern Ireland was unsustainable when it was being treated as British as Finchley. But to this day, there are members of the British Parliament who treat as an outrage the idea that British soldiers who murdered unarmed peaceful civilians in cold blood, that they should even be investigated for those murders. Not being outraged at the result of an investigation, but just the thought that they should be investigated and potentially prosecuted for those murders. And clearly on a vastly smaller scale, the reality is that colonization of India. I was very surprised that you tended to be minimizing the behavior.
India was never colonized. It's a misappropriation of the word.
Well, I'm not going to be caught up on the vocabulary, but the British.
No, but it's important. It's important because there wasn't a big exodus of British people. I will allow in India.
You've made that point, but the core point is that the British rule, or whatever you want to call it, in India was inevitably going to create resistance. And the way in which Northern Ireland was ruled in the 50s, 60s, 70s, what was done was inevitably going to cause strife in society, whereby people could not vote on an equal basis, people could not gain employment on an equal basis, people could not gain housing on an equal basis. And the reality...
That's no longer the case.
No, it is no longer the case. But if you tell people that, by the way, we reserve the right to wind the clock back and go back to it, and we still to this day have people... Well, we have people to this day in the British Parliament, like Johnny Mercer, who treats as an outrage just the thought that somebody who committed murder should be investigated for that murder, not an outcome of an investigation, just the mere investigation of the murder of someone is an outrage because it is a British soldier who murdered a nationalist in Northern Ireland. And if people in Northern Ireland do not have the same rights as somebody who is British and lives in Finchley, you cannot then complain that you're getting different outcomes from those people, that people are going to resist that, can you?
So, I mean, I don't want to get into a debate over the legacy issues. You know, it's a very emotive subject.
Yeah, but we can both agree we want it to stay a legacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
I don't want to go back to the violence. I mean, if you listen to anything I say on just about any political issue, I'm all for looking forward. I'm not interested in historic. I derive great context and foundations and succor from British history, but I'm not interested in the history when it comes to making political decisions now and policies and regulations. We have to look forward, and there's continuity from the past to the future, obviously. And I wouldn't wish to, create a schism between a proud British history and our future. But I'm only interested in looking forward. We are where we are in Northern Ireland, but where we are, or where we were at least before the Northern Ireland Protocol, was a situation in which the East-West strand was equally important, or was on paper is espoused to be as equally important as the North-South strand. Mm-hmm. And that there would be no change in the constitutional setup of Northern Ireland without a plebiscite. And actually, these two things have been abused through the Northern Ireland Protocol.
To just understand that language, to make that language understandable for the listeners, what you're saying is that there should have been a plebiscite in order to give effect to the Northern Ireland Protocol, because that was a material change. And you're saying that, as I understand it from reading your submissions in that case, that the Northern Ireland Protocol should not have been allowed to go ahead without cross-community consent, as was built into the Good Friday Agreement. But pause for that, because that's a very important point.
I just want one more. Can I say one more thing?
Please do, yeah. And then I'll come back to that, yes.
Yeah. And our own acts of union, which are of constitutional importance, which established Parliament itself. The modern Parliament was established through the Act of Union. That Act of Union was inadvertently or deliberately subjugated, breached, or set aside, depending on which court's adjudication you refer to. And I find that an abomination in the context of a British citizen. I find that an abomination and a pox on every single MP who voted for it.
Wasn't the Government of Ireland Act in 1920 amending those acts as well?
No, it didn't. It didn't amend the acts. What it did was take the Republic of Ireland out of those acts.
Oh, okay, but pause for that. And you are defending those acts, and you're saying that the Northern Ireland Protocol was a breach of those. And I actually agree that, at least to the extent that that is an arguable point. In court, you lost on that point, but I would certainly, the court certainly made the correct decision to hear the arguments. There were arguments on that. I don't want to relitigate that.
The Acts of Union had been broken. Very important to recognise that.
Yes, I think superseded. But I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to parse the legal
I can just
part
tell you,
of
the
it.
High Court said they'd been breached, but they'd been legally breached.
Mm-hmm.
The Appeals Court said they'd been subjugated, but they'd been legally subjugated. And then the Supreme Court ruled they'd been set aside and would come back into force as and when the Northern Ireland Protocol was. All the courts agreed the Acts of Union had been
but not
compromised.
consistently.
They used different language to give expression to it.
Sure,
and I find that in itself offensive.
That's fine. That's fine, and that's a very good exposition of that. By the way, another reason they think the Appeal Court in Northern Ireland gave for rejecting it was how you had voted in the European Parliament, and I think that's an outrage that how you or anybody else voted in Parliament because you were one of the litigants doesn't change the legality one way or the other, and I think that was a very wrong judgment.
Well, thank you. That's kind of you to say that.
It's obviously flawed, but my point is, and the core point here is, that to whatever extent the Northern Ireland Protocol breached those preceding laws, as you argued they do, Brexit did also. There is clearly space to argue, as you have done, that the Northern Ireland Protocol was a breach of those. There is, and as the courts have found, there is also space to argue that they were not. But there is no universe possible where you could argue that the Northern Ireland Protocol breached those previous UK treaties and laws, but Brexit did not. That is an intellectually impossible position, isn't it?
Well, no, it's not impossible. I think
so.
It's
Northern Ireland can be
possible.
taken out of the EU from being entirely inside the EU to being entirely outside the EU against the will of the majority of the people in Northern Ireland, and certainly with no cross-community consent, and with no cross-community consent. But to move it, as you might term it, halfway back into the EU, that does require cross-community consent. To me, there is no logic there.
Well, we'll have to agree to disagree on that point. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
To move it out of the United Kingdom requires a plebiscite and requires two things. It requires a plebiscite.
It's not moved out of the United
Ireland.
Kingdom. It's moved out of some UK customs arrangements.
Well, you call it a hard border. I mean, you can't have it each way.
Yeah, there's a hard economic border between Spain and the Canaries. That doesn't mean that Spain is not sovereign in the Canaries.
If you have there are only two things that bind a territory into another constitutionally: political union and economic union. If you separate either one of those, and arguably both have been, Northern Ireland has been separated on both fronts, not just economic, but also political, then it is no longer part of the United Kingdom. And therefore, it's an affront to anyone who believes in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which I do.
Which you're entitled to, and which many people in the North do also, and they're entitled to, to do so. But still, there is, and you're correct, there is an argument. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not qualified to pronounce on it, but you are certainly correct that there is an argument that requires cross-community consent. But there is no space, and I've spoken to unionists on this who concede this, there is absolutely no space for arguing that the entirety of Brexit requires no cross-community consent, but the arrangements to put it into place do, such as the Northern Ireland Protocol. Ben, because I want to answer the point you made exactly. You say, and you hold, as unionists do, that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and you're entitled to say that. But if that's what you believe, then the Parliament of the United Kingdom is entitled to vote whatever the hell it wants to do with Northern Ireland, including making it into a separate economic area.
So there are 2 points on that. The first is I would argue actually that Parliament is not entitled to vote to get rid of Northern Ireland, to break the Acts of Union. I would say that the Acts of Union are of constitutional importance, and only the British people can make a constitutional change of that magnitude.
What about the Irish people?
And equally,
what about the Irish people?
It's part of the United Kingdom. It's not part of the Republic of
No,
Ireland.
hang on a second. The Irish people were regarded as part of the United Kingdom, and without their consent, I note, and the country was divided entirely without the consent of anybody anywhere on the island, except in a couple of smoke-filled rooms in London.
What are you talking about now? 1920?
Yeah, exactly. In a way very, very similar to how Pakistan and India were divided.
That dispute was settled with the Good Friday Agreement.
Precisely. And changes to those arrangements, if that is what you regard them, need cross-community consent. For example, Brexit. There's just no space to argue that the degree of change that is Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol, is a subset of Brexit. That's essentially the point.
No, my point is quite different, and it's as follows. There is a border. If I can just finish the point.
Please do.
I think it's probably best to move on. But
absolutely.
There is a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It separates two different constitutional jurisdictions, two different countries. It also separates and continues to separate two different sets of regulations, currencies, and a whole load of other things that other people that some people may find offensive to them. And there was no reason for there to be any form of hard border, in inverted commas, when it comes to customs checks. And it was quite possible, with goodwill on both sides, to establish a mechanism by which all the issues that you alighted on in terms of the trading of milk, etc., could have taken place without any friction whatsoever. And my position and my view, and remember, I've put tens of thousands of pounds into having this view investigated by the former Attorney General of Northern Ireland, who made the case for me. My view is that we could have achieved everything consistent with Brexit and consistent with Northern Ireland being part of the United Kingdom and consistent with an open trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic. There was no need for the protocol. And it was alighted on by I was in the European Parliament. Barnier used to say the price of Brexit will be Northern Ireland. It was a punishment beating handed out to the United Kingdom by the European Union, and I'm afraid Leo Varadkar and other people like Simon Coveney.
That will enormously amuse people who are, I think, perhaps not supporters of either Leo Varadkar or Simon Coveney in Ireland. But as you're correct, we should move forward on that.
Yeah.
Very, very briefly. Two things. Number one, you mentioned the degree of regulations and laws coming from Europe. And this was a huge theme, and I think a hugely winning point for the Brexit campaign in 2016. Very quietly, this year, the idea of having separate regulations, I presume the idea was to have them simpler and easier to comply with, that's essentially been scrapped. And the UK government has said that this idea of the UKCA mark, instead of having a CE mark of compliance with manufacturing regulations, having that replaced by UK regulations, that's essentially being scrapped. And the UK is saying that they will accept CE regulations, anything that complies with European laws, which they have no participation in creating, will now be accepted in the UK. That seems to be, I mean, I don't want you to answer at length, but it does seem to be throwing out the entire purpose of Brexit from that point of view, at least.
Well, this takes us right back to, I think, somewhere near the beginning of our discussion when I said, and I repeat, my aim is to obliterate the Tory parliamentary party because they stand in opposition to what the electorate wants.
So you're cross with that, but the reason that it was thrown out was because of pressure from British business, because they couldn't cope with having two diverging sets of regulations. But you clearly have said your position on that, and I want to finish on one final thing. Are you going to be a candidate? Do you hope to be an MP?
Yeah. Oh, I don't. Whether or not I'm an MP remains to be seen. But there's no point being in a political party unless I stand for election.
Where are you going to stand?
I will stand. I haven't decided yet. I haven't decided precisely where. But I mean, I will stand for election, and my aim will be to, at the very least, unseat what would probably be a Tory MP, where I stand. And, there are two staging posts just for Reform UK. The first staging post is to make sure the Tory Parliamentary Party is obliterated. That's our first staging post. Then we'll see what comes after that. And hopefully we'll have the balance of power. If we don't, we go on fighting for the next election.
Ben Habib, a deputy leader, one of the deputy leaders of Reform UK, British Pakistani businessman, and entertaining and enlightening to speak to you. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much, William. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Just a couple of notes about fact-checking there. I stumbled over my words and I said that General Reginald Dyer, the guy who ordered the atrocity in Amritsar in 1919, was Jewish. That's not correct. In fact, Edwin Montagu, the India secretary who was seen to be insufficiently supporting Dyer, was the one who was Jewish, and the campaign in favour of Dyer and against Montagu had a very obvious and very explicit anti-Semitic tone. The other thing that Ben said there was that the Brexit Party supplied most, as in a majority, of the ethnic diversity within the European Parliament when they were in that institution. I've been in touch with the Brexit Party press office since then, and they've clarified they're not exactly claiming that. They said that the UK MEPs as a whole supplied about half of the non-white MEPs in the European Parliament. Looking at reporting on that, that doesn't seem to be correct. And of those 9 non-white MEPs from the UK, only 3 of them were from the Brexit Party. And it's perhaps worth stating that the Brexit Party had about 10% non-white MEPs, as opposed to 20% from the Labour Party, and about 12 or 13% each from the Lib Dems and from the Green Party, and astonishingly 25% from the Conservative Party. But that last figure is really skewed because, in fact, all of them are based on very, very small numbers. So 25% is actually one of the 4 Conservative MEPs. There are many other MEPs, about 25, from other countries other than Britain in the European Parliament who would be perhaps non-white, and also those figures are quite blurred because minority could perhaps include, for example, Hungarians living in Romania, ethnic Russians living in the Baltic states, and so forth. But that said, even though Ben, I don't think, got his figures correct on that, I think his point is substantially correct that Britain does quite a lot better than many continental European countries in terms of integrating ethnic minorities. Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Ben Habib at BenHabib6. Get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going. And if you'd like to throw in the price of a pint of beer or even the price of a litre of milk once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.